Welcome, everybody, to my second Spoleto talk, a Spoleto Encore, those sites you can't miss, because Spoleto really does merit a second virtual visit together, even actually a third one. We could do far more even on the wonderful, extraordinary Roman Museum of Spoleto, which we'll be meeting today. And we're going to get right into some of these wonders of Spoleto, a beautiful Umbrian hill town. And I think a perfect place to start is right at the Fonti del Clitunno, which are the springs sacred to the Romans. The Romans very much were devoted to the god Clatumness, who they believed dwelt here in the depths of the river. He might have been sort of an alternative to Jupiter, if you will. There seem to be strong links to the Clatumness Springs, and another site we'll be talking about today, which was also dedicated to a deity, to Jupiter, the god of all gods. The Clatumness Springs have been lauded for centuries. Lord Byron, at the age of 28, was enchanted by the fountains of Clatumness, as they're called, the springs of Clatumness, on his visit there in 1816. And in Lord Byron's Childe Harold's pilgrimage, we can get a sense of the enchantment he felt, the attraction he felt to this exquisitely beautiful site, not too far from the town of Spoleto, when he wrote, "The purest God of gentle waters, and most serene of aspect, and most clear," which you can see right here in this fountain, the splendid waters of the Fonti del Clitunno. Like many rivers in the East Umbrian plain, the spring could be subject to sudden flooding, although it was finally properly managed in the 19th century and is now largely banked by levees. With the 440 BC earthquake, many veins of the spring were altered, and thus the water supply was greatly diminished, though it was still a significant water source in Italy, and it remains one of Italy's most important springs, with the outflow of 1,500 liters per second, roughly 1,500 quarts. The Romans worshipped the god Clatumnus, as mentioned. He was the personification of the river waters, and the people believed that he actually dwelt in the depths of the rivers. The spring festivities honoring him were called the Clitunali, the Clatumnus celebrations, and various sacelli, or small temples dedicated to him, were probably built in his honor in this area. We have here, let me just show you again, the stunning waters of the Clatumnus fountains, as they're called, fonti, meaning the springs, the Clatumnus Springs. We have an image of the Clitunali, the Clatumnus festivities, painted on the theater curtain of the theater called Teatro Clitunno, which is in Trevi, not far from Spoleto. It's between Spoleto and Foligno, Spoleto and Assisi, Trevi, just to help you orient yourselves. And we can see this image here of a small temple, a sacello, and the people going up to the temple where they're going to make their offerings to the god Cletuno. I was recently there. About a month ago. I'd been there many times over the years, but wanted to make a return also for my talk. I wanted to take some photos, and it was truly a wonderful, peaceful afternoon walking all around the circumference of the springs with friends. We later went down the road about 1 kilometer to see the superb Tempietto del Clitunno, built in the 4th to 5th century AD. Some archaeologists think maybe in the 7th century. archaeologists, some feel it was a Lombard edifice. The Lombards were a Germanic people. They had duchies in Italy in the 6th to 8th century AD. Now, this edifice, the Tempietto di Clitunno, is one of 2 UNESCO World Heritage Sites dedicated to the sacred sites of the Lombards. And there are 7 of them in the peninsula of Italy. 2 of them, of the 7, are in the Spoleto area. One is right here at the Fonti del Clitunno, and we're going to see another one, which is actually in the city of Spoleto. You know, for centuries, archaeologists wondered if perhaps the temples had been built by the Romans and later modified by the Lombards, this Germanic people, during the time of the Lombardy Duchy of Spoleto. But now they're inclined to feel it was built always as a Christian edifice, not a Roman edifice. The Lombards in Italy, the places of power, declared UNESCO World Heritage in 2011. And these are the cities. I have been to Brescia with Pino. I absolutely want to go back. I have not seen Cividale dei Frulli. I have not seen this town up here. I've seen Benevento. It's extraordinary. It's a Lombard site. And Monte Sant'Angelo I'd like to return to. These are the 2 Lombard sites, as mentioned, Spoleto and Campello su Cletuno, which is just outside of Spoleto. Now let's have a look at this exquisite Lombard architecture. Clearly Lombard is that cross. That's not Roman, that's Lombard. That is called a croce palmata, the cross with palms. And you can see that this cross is formed from palm leaves. Intertwining around it are grapes. Generally, there'll also be acanthus leaves on the friezes of the Lombard structures, because the acanthus leaves symbolized immortality and resurrection. It appeared on Greek architecture as early as 500 BC. The acanthus leaf, the acanthus was considered healing and medicinal. And here we see the facade again of the marvelous Tempietto del Clitunno. The columns here we can call colonne di spoglio. Spogliarsi in Italian means to undress yourself. So columns of undressing. What does that mean? Columns taken from pre-existing edifices. These columns probably come from Roman sacelli, or small temples, which were in this area, maybe small temples dedicated to the goddess Clatumness. And this frieze across the top is one of the longest epigraphs sculpted on any monument of early Christian architecture. That is about 4th to 8th century AD. There's a section of it here on other sections of the temple because it runs around the temple. And the frieze is a lengthy inscription praising the resurrected God of the angels. You can see that in Latin. The Lord God of the apostles, who remitted all sins, and the Lord God of the prophets, who was the Redeemer. Many historians feel that this kind of inscription indicates that maybe for the Lombard dukes, this was a site of burial, a little temple for the burying of the loved ones. Now, the importance of the Lombard architecture was written up recently by an historian, and I'd like to read this to you about the Tempietto. The general style with which the Tempietto is conceived and the classical language that emerges, both from the reuses of former architecture and from the specially designed and executed ornaments, suggest for the visitor the identification with some members of the Lombard ducal family, intending to emphasize their status and prestige of rank through the evocation of the greatness of Rome and the association with the Roman noble past. So it's as if they're saying, you were great, you Romans, we are just as great and we can match your skill. The skill of the Lombard stonemasons was absolutely astounding, and we're going to see it in another edifice as well. Now, you can go up the steps on the side and you come into this area behind the portico, and this is the view you get from inside the temple looking out. And a very moving experience to just be here in the stillness. When we were there were 3 other people there, and these 2 friends and I. And look at these stunning sculpted columns. Again, spolio, taken probably from a Roman edifice. Now, the facade is on this side, and if you come around the back, the same sort of sculptural work can be viewed above the apse. We have the croce palmata, the grapes, obviously associated with Christ, and intertwining acanthus leaves up here. Now, in 1703, there was a very, very strong earthquake, and the Tempieto had been flanked by 2 porticos. One was here, one was over there. The porticos crumbled in the earthquake of 1703. This etching was done by Giovanni Battista Piranesi in 1748. It's now in the Met, and it shows us what the Tempieto looked like following the earthquake of 1703. And shortly after the earthquake of 1703, the Bishop of Spoleto gave permission to a hermit priest who lived up on the mountain behind Spoleto to sell the marble remnants, the pieces resulting from the earthquake damage, for the purchase of liturgical furnishings for other edifices. So, permitted by the bishop was the taking of marble remnants and the selling of them. That absolutely infuriated Cardinale Carlo Rezzonico. He was the nephew of a pope, Clement VIII, and in an edict of 1767, he forbade the depletion of Roman remnants from the Tempietto del Clitunno. So all I can say is mille grazie Cardinale Rezzonico, that we can see this splendor today. See, there would have been a portico along here, a portico along the other side, absolutely gone. Underneath might have been a small sacello, a small religious edifice, a small temple. And thanks to Carlo Rezzonico, we can enjoy the beauty of the Tempietto del Clitunno. Not to miss, if you're in the Umbria area, you do need to rent a car. The train does not stop near it. It's not far from Spoleto, just a few minutes drive. So this is considered Lombard patrimony, one of the 2 edifices of the 7 in Italy. Another one, as mentioned, is in Spoleto, right in the town. This is just above the cemetery, the Basilica di San Salvatore. This dates to the 4th, either the 4th, 5th century AD, probably that period, maybe slightly early, slightly later. And it seems to have been built on the site of an early Christian cemetery, a burial area. And it was declared patrimony of UNESCO in 2011, along with the Tempietto del Clitunno. Giuseppe Sordini, brilliant late 19th century archaeologist of Spoleto, who made many discoveries, and we're going to talk more about him, called this edifice the Maggiore Monumento Spoletino dell'Antichità. That is Spoleto's most important edifice of antiquity. Now, you can see it has 2 levels. The upper level might have been added under Lombard restoration in the 8th century AD. Over the door, we can see the motif, which we now know is Lombard, everybody, the croce palmata, the palm cross, if you will. And here's a detail of the architrave, as it's called, over the main doorway. We're remembering again that this is done by Lombard architects. They were Germanic people from the north. One of their dukedoms was also in the Milan area. The other duchy of the Lombardy was Benevento in southern Italy. And here is the facade. Restoration was done in 1997. Now, according to legend, Concordio, a saint of Spoleto, was martyred in this area in the 2nd century AD. He was martyred under the domination of Marcus Aurelius. And it said that he was buried in an area where the waters are sacred. And near the Basilica of San Salvatore, there were sacred waters considered sacred up into the Middle Ages by the people. The writing in Latin of Concordio's death said he was buried, and I think I have the quote, not far from the city in an area with abundant waters. And the waters were recognized as miraculous and therapeutic right up to the 18th century. It's also said that another early Christian saint, San Sensia, lived on this hill where the Basilica of San Salvatore was built, and San Sensia killed a dragon, symbol probably of pagan adoration. So again, restored by the Lombards in the 8th century, the stunning edifice. Now, this is the inside. I think, Mary, you might remember it from our elder hostel trips. We were in this edifice. This photo I took from this site, Luoghi del Silenzio, because now the basilica is closed. The main door is open with a glass so you can see inside. It must be restored. It did take some damage in the earthquake of 2016. And you can see that this too is an edifice of spolio, recycled materials. Look at these exquisite Roman columns, Roman capitals, again, put together by the Lombards, and then restored by them also once, a few years after it was built in the 8th century. Here you can see some of the exquisite detail of the capitals. Isn't that something? And look at how they're used. Here's a capital, blocks of stone. But these exquisite capitals pieced together, pieces added, hold up a stunning vault, which is this. This is a shot of the vault. And the vault is probably 8th century over the apse in the Basilica di San Salvatore. And this is what you see now when you look in the door through the glass. That's all you can see. So one of the splendors of Spoleto for sure. Now it is overlooking the cemetery. This is the Basilica di San Salvatore. These steps lead down into the cemetery. And this again is one of the stunning doors. This is one of the doors on the right. Now let's go into the cemetery called the Cimitero Monumentale. We go down these steps, and then we're walking through this splendid cemetery. The Cimitero Monumentale, monumental cemetery of Spoleto, was designed in the neoclassical style by Ireneo Aleandri in the early 19th century. In this cemetery, you will see every single imaginable architectural style. This seems to be a small Gothic church. This seems to be a Renaissance church. These are family tombs. Again, various architectural styles. And there are the tombs here of some important people including Giuseppe Sordini, and I did not see his tomb and didn't know he was buried here, the great archaeologist, until after I left and reading about it. And you walk down these viale, almost a quiet little street of Spoleto. This is in the Cimitero Monumentale. This is Gothic. This is Renaissance neoclassical. This is Romanesque. All the architectural styles are here. So absolutely beautiful. And a couple of the family tombs, the Antonelli tomb on the left, the Sansi tomb on the right. The work is done in exquisitely beautiful work, adding architectural elements from the past. This tomb has sculptural work, which dates from the 15th or 16th century. This too beautiful sculptural work from the Renaissance period. And then in the cemetery, there are two areas covered over with the loggiato, a kind of loggia or a gallery. These are all tombs along here. You enter in through the loggiata. You know, the loggiato, excuse me. Also, I thought very beautiful to note in the cemetery are the variety of the lamps, the vigil lamps. They're all in metal and they vary in their styles. You can see this one here, another one here. So a walk through the cemetery is a walk which can enchant you really for a full morning. I like this part very much because off over the tombs, you could see a Spoleto's churches peeping up and the bell towers. Here you see Spoleto behind these tombs here. And visits are common to the cemetery. You'll see a lot of fresh flowers. This woman with her son, whose adopted son, we talked for a while. They were visiting the nonna, the grandmother of the young boy. So the cemetery, you know, you don't usually think when you go to a town, let's go to the cemetery. But if you go to Spoleto and go to the church of the Basilica, that is, of San Salvatore, you definitely want to stop also and see the Cimitero Monumentale. Now, speaking of Giuseppe Sordini, and I read his quote at the beginning, the great archaeologist, he made wonderful discoveries in the late 19th century. One of those was the Roman theater of Spoleto. Parts of it were visible, but people thought they were thermal baths at the time. They weren't sure what they were. The theater of Spoleto was built in the 1st century BC, and it was used for theatrical entertainment until the 4th century after Christ. Now, the day I took this photo, this area was covered over the orchestra area to protect the stone. There had been a strong rain, and there was going to be a theatrical presentation that night. I think that's another reason it was covered over. And when I visited, what I really love seeing as this is a young girl, her name is Livia. Isn't it wonderful? Her name is Roman. We talked well. I said, you're at the Roman theater and your name is Roman. Livia and her sister were there with their mother visiting from, her sister's name is Greek, Delia, visiting from San Gimignano. And they sat there near the theater. Livia painted it. Her sister drew it. And I thought it was wonderful that the Roman theater of Spoleto is still a place of entertainment. You see, normally you can see the polychrome marble slabs of the 4th century AD, which are on the floor of the orchestra. And marble slabs were brought from all different areas of the Roman Empire to adorn the theater of Spoleto. Of course, it's a site that's used during Giancarlo Menotti's Spoleto Festival that we talked about in our first talk on Spoleto. So there's the theater filled with people during the Spoleto Festival. Another view. Please note the apse here of a church called Sant'Agata, which we'll be talking about. And there's the apse again of the Church of Sant'Agata. This is about where our family sat Many years ago, Julia was 10. She was taking ballet. She was 10. Mattia must have been 13, Keegan 14 and a half. I got tickets to the Spoleto Festival to see the New York City Ballet perform here on a night in June. It was an event that none of us will forget. Not Julia, not myself, not Pino, not the boys, really something else. Our seats were right about here. Now here we have the two girls, Livia painting and Delia drawing, and they were painting and drawing the Roman theater of Spoleto. It's just wonderful to see, the rapport people still have with this theater and not just, going to theatrical presentations. Now, near the theater is the Church of Sant'Agata. This is an 11th century church. It's not open now, but part of it becomes a section of the museum along with this area with porticos. This was a Benedictine convent of the 14th century, incorporated into a palace, a medieval palace called Palazzo Corvi, because in the 14th century, just after, I think the end of the 14th century, one of the nuns in the convent adjacent to Sant'Agata was of the Corvi family. And so the noble palace was incorporated into the convent called Monastero in Italian. And this now is where the Archaeological Museum of Spoleto is housed. Now we're going to go around to the front of Sant'Agata, which we see as we walk down a street of Spoleto, a very narrow street. We can still see the beautiful portico of the 11th century of Sant'Agata, but it is closed now because nearby is the entrance into the Archaeological Museum of Spoleto. Here you can see the columns of Sant'Agata. Right about here will be the entrance into the Museo. Now, walking down this street, here is Sant'Agata, the convent. It was adjacent to the monastery, the church. It was adjacent to the convent. The convent was incorporated into a noble palace, Palazzo Corvi. I'm going to show you something related to this palazzo in a minute. So here I am heading, he's coming away from the museum, and I'm heading to the museum. So right down from the museum, if you look up on the wall, what do you see? Corvi, crows. They were the symbol of the Corvi family. The Palazzo Corvi is the oldest medieval palazzo in Spoleto. It becomes part of the monastery of Sant'Agata, which we say monastery in Italian, monastero, but it is convento. For us, a convent, it's a place where the nuns would stay, Benedictine nuns. So one of the Benedictine sisters is part of the Corvi family. She inherits the Corvi palace, and the palace is thus incorporated into the structure of the convent, the Benedictine convent of the 14th century. Now let's go back here. There's the crows. So they're on a corner wall. The Benedictine convent of the 14th century, as of 1870, is the Carcere Femminile, and not 1979, excuse me, that is my error, and I'm going to take that out right now. As of 1870, this is the women's prison of Spoleto, and it remains women's prison till 1954. And as you walk in now, towards this convent, called in Italian monastero, if you look left, you're seeing Roman ruins, because this now on 3 floors houses the archaeological treasures of Spoleto, not just Roman. And there, the convent would be over here. On the left is the Roman theater. This is all one complex now. To go into the theater, you go through the museum. Its full name is Museo Archeologico Nazionale e Teatro Romano di Spoleto. So the National Archaeological Museum and the Roman Theater of Spoleto. And it is an astounding treasure of objects. I'm just going to mention a couple of them because, as I said, there could be a whole third talk on just this museum. One of the most stunning objects in the museum that I saw is this. This is 5th century marble made in Greece, the nymph Aura, possibly later transformed into Venus and used to decorate the theater. She was probably fit into a niche. I would like you to observe the transparency of her garment. You can see her breast through the garment. This is marble. I mean, is that one of the most astounding things you have ever seen? I was a long time in front of the statue. This is actually one of the feet. Some archaeologists feel, they all agree that it's 5th century Greek marble. And many feel that it was probably brought to this peninsula during one of the Roman conquests of that part of Greece, then resculpted and transformed into Venus. Others feel it was always like this, the marble nymph, Aura, and was used to decorate, adorn the theater, fitting in one of the niches as you enter the theater without restoration. But as it was right from the beginning, this was the treasure. And that's something. Then as you walk through countless treasures from 600 BC, the Umbrian period, through the Roman period, you come to a room at the end, and on the wall is a Last Supper. And this was the convent's refectory. That is where the nuns ate. And I'm going to talk about this figure here and this figure here. But this is one of the most important, I should take that out, pardon me. This is one of the most important rooms in the museum because it holds a cippo. A cippo is a marker. This is sculpted on limestone, and it was sculpted in the 3rd century before Christ. And we're going to talk about its significance in a second. But first, I want to talk about this figure right here. This is Santa Agata. Her breasts were cut off. She's holding them on a plate. She was martyred in 250 AD. The palm is a symbol for martyr saint. So, of course, she's going to appear in this refectory of the Church of Santa Agata. At the other end of the table is Gabriele Vigili and her son. This is the woman who paid for the fresco. She's the patron, and they're very piously praying. Now let's go back and talk about the cippo, or tomb marker. This was a cippo which can be called Lex Luci or Lex Spoletina. This is one of the most extraordinary finds, archaeological finds ever found in the Spoleto area. It was found by the great archaeologist Giuseppe Sordini. It seemed to have been walled into a country house he had. It was sculpted in the 3rd century BC, and it is sculpted to warn people that the woods of Spoleto, backdropping the town, called Monte Luco, the area, the mountain of the Lucas, which means sacred woods, those woods may not be cut nor touched. So this Lex Luci, or Lex Spoletina, the law of Spoleto, or Lex Luci means the law of the sacred woods. Lucas would be the sacred woods. This is the oldest forestry law existing in Italy. It is still valid. No trees may be cut in the woods of Monte Luco, backdropping Spoleto, because this is a sacred wood. And the inscription says, among other things, questo bosco nessuno profani ne asporti con cari ne con braccia. It starts by saying this woods nessuno, no one may profanate. Do we say that in English? No one may profane, pardon me, I don't speak English anymore. No one may profane this woods, neither take away wood with carts, nor with arms. And it goes on to say, if it is done, you must offer an oxen as sacrifice and pay, I think it's 100 assi, which were the coins then. So this is certainly one of the treasures of this extraordinary museum, this Lex Luci or Lex Spoletino. Now let's look at this museum for a minute. This is quite a wonderful video. And I don't think it needs many comments. There's writing at the bottom, but it's dark and it's in English. There's Spoleto, of course. There's the theater. And it says that this was a Roman colony as of 241 BC called Spoletium. There's the theater, and you can see the marble there, the orchestra. It was dated as of 1 BC, and it was incorporated into medieval edifices, and it's used during the Spoleto festival. Look at the marble there. You get a good view of it. Look at the apse of Sant'Agata. This is the Museum of Spoleto. It's set into the convent of Sant'Agata. And now we're walking through. Rick, I don't know if we could turn up. There's nice music in the background. These are 600 BC. These objects date from 600 BC. This is a scepter of a Roman. This is before Christ. This is a child's toy. This is Roman, a kind of rattle. Roman bronze objects and Roman lamps. And these are 600 BC. These are votive objects found in tombs. Just so you can see some of the treasures of this museum. And then this talks about the Lex Spoletino and the statue of Ora of 500 BC. These are some pieces. These were in the theater. This is the Lex Spoletina. We've seen the convent wall with the scene of the Last Supper. The artist is unknown. The patron, Sant'Agata, this head was in the theater. These pieces were also decorations in the theater. And here's the beautiful nymph Aura. Look at the transparency depicted in marble. Everybody, it's worth coming to Umbria just to go see her. And this is produced actually by the museum. Now, the person who is responsible for the glory of today, and he actually started the first archaeological museum of Spoleto, is Giuseppe Sordini. This is Giuseppe Sordini with his wife in front of the Basilica of St. Francis right here, end of the 19th century. He was officially called the Ispettore ai Monumenti agli Scavi, the official inspector of monuments and excavations. And in 1891, he came across this drawing. This was a drawing by Baldassare Peruzzi, done in the early 16th century. It's now in the Uffizi. And he had scribbled here, Monastero di Moniche, convent of nuns. So that helped Sordini understand that something extraordinary was once near the convent of the nuns, and that wasn't a series of old Roman baths or anything, but it was the theater. And so excavation will start. But only in 1933, his discovery was at the end of the 19th century. But remember that the convent at the time was a woman's prison. Excavation started in 1933, and then excavation goes on from 1954 to 1960. So these photos are from the city of Spoleto, and this will show you what we knew of the Roman theater. Look at, you can see this, just a few steps. People thought it for years that this was a series of, thermal baths or something. All this was still to be excavated. So all this glory is thanks to Giuseppe Sordini. Now, also sites to be seen in Spoleto related to the Roman period are some of the churches, and we're going to talk about two in particular. San Ponciano. And San Ponciano was built between the 11th and 13th century. It's named after a martyr of Spoleto called San Ponciano, who was martyred in the 2nd century AD. He was martyred under the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who was emperor from 161 to about 180 AD. And it's thought that he was martyred in the area, actually, of the amphitheater, which we no longer can actually visit. That has to go under restoration. Not the theater, but the amphitheater. But his burial site was either near the amphitheater or probably here, where there was an early Christian cemetery. And later, on this site of an early Christian cemetery, the church of San Ponciano will be built between the 11th and the 13th century. And here's San Ponciano, and it's very close to San Salvatore. And that too was a sacred site for the Romans. And that was the site of the martyrdom of the early Christian saint San Concordio, as you may remember. So these churches are probably built on sites of former early Christian cemeteries. The Feast of San Ponciano is celebrated January 14th, and this is an image of the celebration of his feast in 1895. They say his martyrdom was on January 14th. He is considered the patron saint of Spoleto, and he's considered the protector against earthquakes as of 1703, because earthquake struck the area. A very heavy, devastating earthquake struck this area during evening vespers in the church of San Ponciano. But very little happened to the city of Spoleto, and I believe there were no deaths. And even today, and so they say San Ponciano protected them. So even today, in the Spoleto area, if there's a tremor, the people don't say, "È passato un terremoto," an earthquake passed. They say, "È passato San Ponciano." San Ponciano passed, because they know that he'll save them. Now, there was a medieval church, which must have been very beautiful, but alas, restored over the centuries, and final restoration was done by Giuseppe Valadier in 1788. And fortunately, when he restored, he did not touch the crypt. And let us go in to see the splendor of the crypt. We're going to be passing sarcophagi on the left, on the right. They're Paleo-Cristiano, meaning early Christian, could be 3rd to 5th century AD. And we enter into this extraordinary crypt. And what are we seeing? A splendid crypt done of, now you know the word, materiale di spoglio, taken from pre-existing edifices, maybe Roman. And they were sculpted down later in the 11th, 13th century to build this crypt, to hold up this crypt here. This column here is quite extraordinary because it rests on an inverted capital, a beautiful capital, probably of a Roman temple. And each actually of the columns in this church are exquisitely beautiful. and unusual, really, is that quite often the capitals of previous columns, which have been on top, are used as the base. So when you go to Spoleto and see San Salvatore, you want to stop in San Ponciano, above all, to see the splendid crypt. There was a young couple down there the day I was photographing. She was taking some astounding photos, I'm quite sure. And she's shooting a photo now at the Trinity fresco, which I'm going to show you. And she's shooting her photo right over sarcophagus here. And I believe it's the middle one, which is said to be the one that was a Lombard sarcophagus. The only Lombard sarcophagus, I believe, confirmed by archaeologists, because sculpted on the lid of that sarcophagus was his name, Agipertus. And that therefore confirms the religious area. This as a religious area, very important to the Lombard dukes as well, and probably a burial area also during the Duchy of Spoleto, during the Ducato of Spoleto. Let's see here. So here we see the Holy Trinity on this wall. And I'm also going to talk about this fresco here and this little soul going to heaven. We're going to talk about it in a minute. But I just want to point out this. This is the main apse. This is the apse on the right. And we're also going to see something about the apse on the left. Now let's look at the Trinity. This is done by a minor Umbrian painter called the Maestro del Dormitio di Terni, which means the master of the sleeping in Terni. It's the sleeping virgin. And he painted a fresco in the town of Terni. This is 1400. We see the Trinity, God the Father, holding his son who's crucified. Perched on an arm of the cross is the dove, the Holy Spirit. These are probably patrons. Perhaps this was sponsored either by a family or by confraternity. So here, this is the Trinity here. And in the center apse, we have a crucifixion. The altar here is made of a simple slab of stone, and this is probably a Roman stone. It could be a marker, a tomb marker. It could be a cipo, as it's called, which means marker. Now let us look at this crucifixion because it's quite curious. It's quite ruined. This is called the crucifixion with the two Marys and the little soul, Animula, of the 14th century, unknown artist. These are the two Marys, the Virgin, the Magdalene. She's generally dressed in red. Now let us look at these two angels. They're carrying to heaven San Ponciano's soul, martyr of the 2nd century AD, who's the patron saint of Spoleto. So we'd call this in English animola, I guess you'd say in Italian. It means little baby soul, or soul of a little one going to heaven. And then on the other side of the crucifixion to the left, there's an apse on the left. Very curious, actually, here. We have ex voto figures, figures painted for thanks for a favor received. Ex voto meaning out of a vow. You thanked the Virgin for something she's done for you, or you're painting this so that she will answer your prayer. So 2 of the statues are ex votos, and 2 are Black Plague saints. Ex voto frescoes, Saint Sebastian, pierced with arrows, Saint Roch, coming from France, early Christian, pointing to the pustule on his leg. He was accompanying people who had the Black Plague. And then let's go back. We have 2, 3. These are ex voto frescoes. I read about this in a book I found on this church. It took me forever to find a book. Nothing's been written. This is extremely curious. These are ex votos to thank the Lord for having been healed from Mediterranean anemia. Now, I don't know what makes anemia Mediterranean, but these are ex votos for healing from Mediterranean anemia. So the splendor of San Ponciano is in the crypt. It's certainly in the facade, the rose window. The rose window is missing, but is surrounded by the figures in limestone. This is from the 12th, 13th century of the four evangelists. We have Matthew's angel, John's eagle, Mark's lion, the oxen of Luke. So let's see if we can see these close up. The angel of Matthew, the eagle of John. And here we have the lion of Mark and the oxen of Luke. So they're around the rose window. And very beautiful is the main entrance, the portal, because it is surrounded by cosmatesque tile work, mosaics done with small bits of varieties of stone. And of course, over the entrance, what do we have? A sign most of you probably recognize, the Lamb of God, Agnus Dei. So the door is extremely beautiful. San Ponciano, the church is dedicated to him. And here's a fresco of San Ponciano. Author unknown, the painter is unknown. It is actually in another church of Spoleto, which is another gem, called the Basilica di San Gregorio Maggiore, 11th, 12th century. This is a church of spolio, recycled materials. This bell tower was finished in 1492, but the whole lower level is all spolio, stones taken from pre-existing Roman edifices. It's thought that here too was an early Christian cemetery, because it's thought that buried in this area was San Gregorio. San Gregorio was an early Christian martyr. I believe he's the end of the 5th century. And he was martyred in the area of the amphitheater. His body was taken and carefully buried with great delicacy by a holy woman called Abundanza. And another Abundanza, this is about the 5th century AD, another Abundanza in the 8th century AD will restore the little cemetery church, so it will start to become something more important. The portico on it is not 11th, 12th century, it's 16th century. The church has gone through restoration over the centuries, the 14th century, the 16th century, the 18th century. And in the 18th century, it really became a Baroque edifice, but later restoration took all the Baroqueness, if you will, off. So it has gone back to its wonderful Romanesque feel with a raised altar. We call this a raised presbytery. And there are frescoes here and there in the church, different frescoes. Most date from the 14th to 15th century. We don't know the names of the painters. This is Madonna del Latte, the Virgin nursing the Christ child. There's more than one Madonna del Latte actually in this church. But one of the most curious of the frescoes is another one by the Maestro del Dormitio di Terni, whom we had met in San Ponciano. This is an extraordinary fresco. It is the Virgin enthroned in an exquisite Gothic throne, and at her feet is Eve. This was in the apse till the 1950s, and then it was moved here. This is a rather sumptuous Eve. She's scantily clad. She's laying in the grass quite casually below the Virgin. This is the first time I have ever seen a fresco depicting Eve with the Virgin. And it is in the church of San Gregorio Maggiore in Spoleto. Why is it called San Gregorio Maggiore? Because there were other San Gregorio churches in Spoleto. There were two. One of them was actually called San Gregorio della Sinagoga. And that will tell us there was an extensive Jewish community in Spoleto in the Middle Ages. And that San Gregorio della Sinagoga was built near the synagogue, which no longer exists. San Gregorio as well has an astounding crypt with columns of spolio, or we also say reimpiegate, reused, recycled. Today, people recycle their plastic. They recycle their glass. They recycle their paper. The Romans recycled their sculptures. Well, not the Romans, the Lombards, and then, well, the Romans too recycled what was found previously. They recycled the things that were Etruscan, the things that were Umbro. And then the people in the Middle Ages and the early Christian period, and later the Lombards will recycle the Romans masterpieces. And here you can see the beautiful crypt. It has 5 naves. The crypt of San Gregorio with materiale di spoglio, recycled material. Beautiful altar covering also in the Assisi cross stitch, which we talked about in one of my talks on the Assisi artisans. Some of you may remember the exquisite Assisi cross stitch. I was surprised to see it in Spoleto, actually, because it's more typically seen in Assisi. And there's the peacock, symbol of everlasting life, the Crypt of Spoleto. In 1907, thanks to Giuseppe Sordini, great archaeologist, the Baroque was eliminated and it returns to its stunning Romanesque. So, mille grazie, Giuseppe Sordini. I really should have dedicated this talk to you. You were the one who, if you can remember my first Spoleto lecture, discovered the Roman house. You provided restoration of the Roman theater. You took the Baroque off the temple to San Gregorio. You found the Lex Spoletina, the law protecting the sacred woods of Monteluco. So let me dedicate this to all of you with a little bit of an extra thank you to Giuseppe Sordini. And may we all meet soon in Spoleto, preferably at the Fonti del Clitunno. We can start to take in the marvelous splendors of the city of Spoleto. In the meantime, I thank you for being here. It's been a joy to share with you. Again, many thanks if you're able to make a contribution. I think you probably know Zoom work is a ton of work. It's been 3 trips to Spoleto plus hours and hours with the books. But what's been positive about COVID is my understanding of this extraordinary region of Umbrian. Not only has just, it's blasted twofold. So thank you for being here.